Okay, good evening everyone. We've had a very well-rounded seminar series this semester. We've had lots of academics, as always. We've had scientists from research councils, we've had freelance researchers and archaeologists, and now we're rounding the series off, very fittingly, with a museum archaeologist. So today we're lucky to have Dr. Alice Stevenson from the Petrie Museum of Egyptian Archaeology at UCL. She's an expert in Egyptian archaeology and prehistory, having recently moved to this museum from Pitt Rivers, where she was it 4 years, 6 years you were there?
4 years.
4 years there, working as a research fellow on world archaeology, so her span extends far beyond just Egypt. And I think I'll leave it to you from there, actually,
Great.
if I may.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much for inviting me to Cardiff. I was quite delighted to get the invitation, because at the time the invitation came in, I was just beginning to try and write a paper on time, state formation, ritual, all these really big ideas. And I set myself a deadline to get this beast done by the end of 2013. I'm just about finishing up this paper, so you could say it's very timely that I'm here. Sorry, don't worry, I won't make bad puns all the way through. But essentially what I'm doing is experimenting a little bit with on you guys today. I've been involved in quite a lot of different projects over the last few years, and two of these completely independent projects have started to come together in my mind, and I'm interested in exploring ways in which I can actually interrelate these two projects. And the two projects were, on the one side, a very scientifically based one. This is a radiocarbon dating project based at the Research Lab for Art History and Archaeology at Oxford, mainly led by Dr. Michael D, who I understand is coming to talk to you next term, so I'm hoping that I won't steal his thunder. But it was a collaborative project with Mike D, with Chris Bronk-Ramsey, with Andrew Shortland from Cranfield University, David Wengrow from UCL, and myself. And the aim of the project was to construct a new absolute chronology for the period from the 5th millennium through to the early 3rd millennium BC for Egypt. And just to kind of orientate the non-Egypt people in the room, this is the timeline everyone's familiar with. There's Tutankhamun, far too recent, the Great Pyramids, not so great. We're actually more interested in this section down here in prehistory. And this is a very, very interesting period because it witnesses really quite profound changes in social complexity. From agro-pastoralist groups at the end of the 5th millennium BC, and then through the 4th millennium BC, we've got these groups having a greater commitment to cereal agriculture, becoming more sedentary, more tethered to the landscape around the Nile, and by the end of the millennium, we have the first territorial state in the world, headed by the institution of divine kingship, and that really sets the tone for the next couple of millennia. So, to get an absolute time frame for these developments is fundamental. So that was project number one. Project number two came from an invitation I got to attend one of these McDonald Institute seminars that Colin Renfrew occasionally runs. And this one was an attempt to see, in prehistory across the world, whether or not we could look at immortality. When did the human belief in the afterlife emerge in different times and places? And could we look at that through the methods of archaeology? So I went along as the early Egypt person to talk about how I thought the ancient Egyptians had such a commitment to the afterlife and provision to the dead, and this very elaborate belief in the afterlife. And so I was looking to chart that in prehistory. In order to do that, I started thinking through a group of experimental psychologists who'd been working in the 1970s. And they had been looking at how humans manage their fear of death. And one of the things they looked at was this idea of experiential immortality, how humans get a belief in transcending life through experiencing feeling. So it's very much embodiment. And so I got to explore embodiment and ritual and what the material correlates of that might be. So in a sense, on the one hand, we've got this first project, which is in Bailey's kind of thinking, is this temporal archaeology. That's chronological time, chronometric time. That's project number one. Project number two is more about this post-processual interpretive archaeological drive to understand how past communities experienced time. So we've got, this generally seems to be one of the ways in which people envision an archaeology of time is in these two domains. You could also look, Shanks and Tilley similarly drew this distinction between human substantial time, the experience of time, and abstract chronometric time that we as archaeologists construct. And I'm quite interested in seeing how the two can relate. This is what I want to try and merge, because I think what can be seen in some of the models, the chronometric models that Mike has been building, are actually capturing the moments in prehistory when there is reorientation of experience of time. I think there's a way of interpolating these two things. So how am I going to try and do this? I'm going to do this this evening through three parts to my talk. In the first part, I'm going to introduce you to the material culture, to the archaeology of Predynastic and early Dynastic Egypt, and look historically at how time has been constructed for that. And that's looking really at the work of Flinders Petrie. I'll then move on to the new dates that we've got out of this project, and I'm not going to talk too much about the methods, and I'm really going to cut to the chase and tell you what I think some of the results mean. And then I'm going to finish with a case study to try and bring these things together and try and show you that what I think I can see, which is that the detail in the chronometric scales that we are getting at the end of the 4th millennium BC reflect fundamental changes in the way prehistoric societies were experiencing time as the state emerged, that there's a new time that the Egyptian state instantiates, brings forth. So I recognise this is rather ambitious for 40, 50 minutes, but I'm really just throwing these ideas out there. This is part of this experiment, and I'll just be interested to see what kind of response there is, what kind of questions there are. So I'm going to begin not in the 4th millennium BC, and actually not even in Egypt. This, I don't know if anyone recognises it, this is Saint-Ochil. This is France, 1859. And this is this picture that Gamble and Krzyzewski published in their antiquity paper talking about the stone tool that broke the time barrier. Because this controversial point in Victorian archaeology was when the idea of human antiquity really opened up. That what Tim Murray has called an abyss of possible time emerged. Now that abyss of possible time could be given some kind of shape through typological means, whether we're talking about Thompson or Worthay or Montelius. But for many people, true chronological detail, quantifiable chronological detail, did not come around until the 20th century with the advent of radiocarbon dating. So until recently, until the work that I'm sure you're all very familiar with here at Cardiff, of course, Alistair Whittle and the Gathering Time, that for the British Neolithic, you had all these kind of social practices. The narratives about the British Neolithic were based on these free-floating social practices that were kind of somewhere in the 4th millennium BC. But until those massive statistical analysis of all those dates, the sites couldn't really be anchored, and that kind of temporal definition wasn't going to emerge. For the very same millennium in Egypt, radiocarbon dates already face a period that's been sharply defined through a very detailed relative dating sequence. And that's a sequence that Flinders Petrie put together. There he is, the man himself. This is him in 1881. This was his first visit out to the Giza Plateau to measure the pyramids, prove that they didn't have weird pyramid inches and all this hidden esoteric knowledge. And of course, when Petrie goes out to Egypt at this time, in 1881, Egypt's prehistory is still exceptionally controversial. There's really, even any idea that it's a Paleolithic, even that hand axe could belong to human antiquity. No. This is where civilization sprouted forth. Flint tools, they're used for carving hieroglyphs, they're used in mummification. Any sense of prehistory is really absent. And even when Petrie comes in 1894 to write his first of his histories of Egypt, his prehistoric chapter, it's incredibly short. He can't cite a single piece of material evidence, despite the fact Pitt Rivers has found, of course, and tried to show stratigraphically that stone tools are in situ. He still doesn't cite any material evidence for prehistory. He calls really a lot of it a blank. And he has a few kind of hypotheses about racial types and people and where Egypt might come from, but really he's got nothing solid. However, by 1901, he can grandly say that the monumental history has been carried back to the very beginning of the written record, which has been entirely confirmed. He's an incompetent man. And beyond all that, the whole course of the prehistoric civilization has been mapped out for perhaps 2,000 years, more completely than has been done for such ages in any other land. So within 6 years, he's given prehistory an exceptional level of detail. And actually that is true. Nowhere else had this kind of detail. So how did he do this? And this is important because this is where all of our ideas about state formation still are pinned on the ideas that came out of Petrie's dating. So the same year, his book comes out on the history of Egypt. Him and his teams excavate this large necropolis at Nagada in Upper Egypt, Nagada and Balas. There's about 2,000 burials here. Kind of like this, everyone's favourite pre-dynastic Egyptian, of course, in the British Museum, formerly called Ginger. I understand we're not allowed to call him Ginger anymore. Being Scottish and having many Ginger friends, they're very proud to be Ginger. I don't quite understand this, but anyway. They are simple pit burials in the ground. However, these are arenas for display. They are very richly furnished. We have very careful orchestration of material goods around the body. The kinds of material that are found here, Petrie called wholly un-Egyptian. However, being the good scientist, the Victorian polymath that he was, he went about classifying this pottery, and I'll just introduce it because not only is it stunning, and not only will I get a chance to show off some of the collections at the Petrie Museum, but they're also the fundamental basis for deriving this time and sequence and detail for prehistoric Egypt. So you recognise cross-lined ware, which is some of the first visual iconography in pottery that we get in the Nile Valley. Some of these are just some of the most stunning pottery, I think, from Egypt. I'm very biased, of course. This very, very diagnostic black-topped pottery, and I'm quite excited because one of these has turned up in a garage in Cornwall and it's been donated to the museum, excavated in 1894, and given to a taxi driver in the 1950s in order to pay for a bill. But it is and was excavated by Petrie at Nagada, so I'm enormously excited. It looks just like that. Wavy handled, you're beginning to get how he's classifying this. The wavy handled ware, it's got wavy handled lines. Decorated ware, slightly different from the cross-lined ware. This is red, deep red painting on a beige background. He's got his rough ware. You don't see these in museum shelves. For some reason, people didn't feel these were display worthy. However, they do form a very important component of the grave assemblages. Fancy ware, which was absolutely and utterly everything else that didn't quite fit into any other category. And as you can see, it's all sorts of imports and oddities. So this is what Petrie had in front of him. Now, he called this wholly un-Egyptian. This clearly were invaders to Egypt. These were clearly people that brought about the collapse of the Pyramid Age. And it was actually his French rival, Jacques de Morgan, who said, no, no, I think these are prehistoric. I think these are pre-dynasty, pre-dynastic. Petrie begrudgingly accepted this, although he said that De Morgan must have come up with this by a happy guess. But he went on to try and get some kind of order out of the accumulated mass of hundreds of pottery assemblages. And one of the ways to sort this pottery out into a sequence was through a few observations, such as this type of decorated pottery was never found with this type of decorated pottery. So C-ware was never found with D-ware. So you could separate the graves that have this pottery from that pottery. And then another key observation, and I'll come back to this because it's quite important, is that there was a degeneration form from cylindrical pottery with these wavy, pronounced wavy handles to, over time, this was his hypothesis, that over time we would get to more cylindrical, with just the wavy line as just tagged on round the edge. So that gave him a backbone. What he did, and this is extraordinary, is he got all of these little slits. Each one of these is a grave. Each one of the columns is a type of pottery, and within that, each different type. And he sat down one very rainy London summer and played out a giant game of patience, essentially. So he started to group together like with like, and just think of how to do this when you've got lots of different types. This is a compromise between competing claims for nearest proximity. So you've got lots of different types, and you're trying to just get the minimum dispersion of types of pottery, and that is presumed to be a temporal sequence. So this is one of the ones that we've got in the Petrie Museum. There are 9 of these. It's an extraordinary feat. I love that they're grubby at the edges. You can just get the sense of Petrie, the swapping of hands that must have gone around. And by the end of this, slide he doesn't want to show, what he did with these was he called them sequence dates. So he grouped each of these. You can see these little slips. This is SD50, this is SD51, so on and so forth. So different types of pottery had a different sequence date. To this, he was then able to, so he constructed these sequence dates. And then, this was in 1899. And in 1899 to 1900, he worked at this site, the site of Abydos, and this is going to be my key case study for today. And this is where the very first kings of Egypt are buried. And Petrie excavated these and was able to pull out lots of pottery and stone vessels that had kings' names. This is called a serech. You're all probably more familiar with cartouches, with the king's name. This is the early names. They weren't cartouches at this point. And Petrie was able to put into sequence then the first kings of Egypt. And so he then had a kind of pulley, a pivot point, from which he could hang his prehistoric sequence. And so it's after doing this that he can say that the monumental history has been taken back. He's got all the first kings of Egypt lined up with their reigns, and it can go all the way back. He can marry the pottery together. Now, that story is mythologized as the way in which it's the first example of seriation in archaeology. You go to your archaeology textbooks, and there's Petrie, relative dating system using pottery, and it's even Bruce Trigger describes this as a technical development in the history of archaeology. But I'm actually more interested in the social implications, the social historical implications, because Petrie's language and the way he talks about that wavy-handled pottery, that degeneration of form, that's absolutely steeped in the language of Victorian cultural evolutionism. So it's John Evans's serial numismatics that Nathan Schlanger has talked about. It is related to Pitt Rivers's amassing and typological arrangement of collections. It's related to Edward Tyler and his theories of cultural evolution. But Pitt Rivers probably looms particularly large in these stories. Petrie knew Pitt Rivers. They'd met in the clubs in London in the 19th century. So he was very familiar with the language and the ideas that they were talking about. And Pitt Rivers' ideas of sequence and typology owed less to Darwin and more to a guy called Herbert Spencer. And they were underpinned by an ardent conservative belief in gradualism. So change didn't come around because of revolution. It was through continual general progression and development. Petrie subscribed to these beliefs very, very strongly. It's not just a technical, so what Petrie created was not just a framework, it was also an explanatory apparatus for change. That change only happened gradually. In order to get any dramatic change, you had to have invasions or migrations. And you can see, this is his paper on sequences in prehistoric remains, and you can see this in how he refers to this in his last paragraph. In all of these series of changes in slates and tools, we see a regular progression. Yet this dating results solely from the pottery with which they were found, and thus this regularity of the results is the strongest proof of the true and solid basis of classing by sequence dates. The point is that although Petrie knew that his sequence dates did not measure time, they're an ordinal sequence, they're not durations, this idea of regularity was a very seductive narrative. So that, in effect, people in using these relative dates have started to talk about how change happened very gradually and evenly. So for the 4th millennium BC, where we've got this change from pastoralist to a state society, these relative dates have stretched out and been spaced out nice and evenly. So for example, we now no longer refer to Petrie's, and I did have a table that doesn't seem to have shown. He divided his sequence dates into 3 cultures, these 3 invasions, the Amrashian, the Gerzian, and the Sumerian. We still have this tripartite division. Don't worry too much about Nagata 1, Nagata 2, Nagata 3. So that's how people have just tinkered with this relative dating sequence. It's in the details, but it's largely the sketch that Petrie visualizes for us has stood the test of time. So now moving then to the absolute chronologies. What has happened is that there have not been terribly many radiocarbon dates for this period. And where they have been brought together, they've been each stretched and compressed within these relative dating sequences. In effect, you're just recreating, you're just asserting the relative dating sequence. So for example, Petrie in the 80s, when he started gathering together all these early radiocarbon dates, he kind of evenly divided them up. There was a lot of eyeballing, a lot of averaging, and we can see here how the Predynastic begins neatly at 4,000 and nicely takes us to almost 3,000. And how all of these stages are, they're of roughly the same duration. So there's a lot of generalizing that's gone into these into this data, and I've been guilty of it myself. 4th millennium starts at 4,000, 2C to 2D, that's 3600 to 3300. Nice, easy chunks of time, but it's not very helpful when we're trying to understand the pace and the duration of quite complex social changes. And so this is the most recent. This is what's in most of the textbooks. Anyone introducing you to early Egypt, this is kind of how the absolute sequence has been tagged on the relative one. And again, we can see nice and easy, 400 years, 300 or so years. It's fairly even. Essentially, we have a nice picture. This is Mike D's slide. I'm sorry if you see it again next term. But essentially, this is how it's mapped out in radiocarbon years. And this is what we see in the narrative. These are kind of synthetic overviews of early Egypt that we see in various. So Michael Hoffman, very much in the processional mode, he talks about we are struck by the overall similarity in artifact types and their slow, stylistic evolution over time. Then a review at the end of the 20th century says, the consensus appears to be developing that stresses the gradual development of complex society. Then again, in the most recent overview, state formation took place over a long period of time. So it's still very, very generalized. And this is what I'm interested in trying to tease apart. So in this next section, this is I'm drawing largely on Michael Dee's work here, which has been very recently published in September online, where it is absolute chronology for early Egypt. My role in this project was the museum archaeologist. I got to rummage around various museum basements for anything organic, short-lived samples, plants, hair, seeds, basketry, things of that nature, and also to contextualize some of this. So I can't tell you very much about the mystical black box that is Bayesian statistical analysis. However, I've been to enough of Mike Sauce, and just in conversations with him and Christopher Bronk-Ramsey, just enormously excited by the way in which we can be released from typology and the potential for asking much broader questions about tempo, duration, and to get away from sequence itself. So in comparison to the British Neolithic, there are still very few dates for early Egypt, mainly because we can't take any samples out of Egypt whatsoever. There's a famous story of a mud brick. Someone in New York managed to get permission to have a mud brick shipped from Egypt, which was couriered personally all the way. It had its own aeroplane seat. And it had to be couriered back again with its own plane seat, even though it was reduced to a little packet of dust by the end. It's very, very difficult. So we were very reliant on museum collections. We're very aware of problems inherent in the legacy of old museum collections for this sort of analysis. But in the absence of any other opportunity, this is really the best we could do. And I spent a lot of time researching context and records to make sure that we were dating useful things. And in the end, we got 192 dates. These are what the models are based on. That involved 80 new dates and 112 sourced in the literature. It is quite a small sample size in comparison to everything else, but it's still, even with that, showing up some really, I think, interesting results. So if this is what it looked like before, this is what we're suggesting from I'll go through this. Maybe it's the best way to do it. So this is an easier thing for me to talk about. So these are the kinds of time spans. Mike hates this because it's all about probabilities and lots of numbers. But in order to digest and try and synthesize, this is the time frame that he's happy with. So the Bedarian, this is these pastoral groups from the 5th into the 4th millennium BC. That involves 20 dates, so we expanded. There were 12 dates in the literature previously. We expanded that to 20. And there's quite an interesting thing with that, in that just to show you the way in which people have been averaging radiocarbon dates for Egypt, Fekri Hassan in 1985 looked at some of the C14 dates, and he did a kind of eyeballing, and he said, there's obviously a need for more C14 dates. We've got determinations between 400, 800 BC, but the Bedarian may be placed at somewhere between 400 and 4000 BC. So that's without mathematical modelling. That's just on trying to apply common sense and eyeballing. However, when we look at our dates and we added more, the models always played out that the Bedarian could be stretched, that those things that we call Bedarian could be stretched well into the 4th millennium BC. People really didn't like this. People don't like this at all. So for everyone, Megada 1, well, that's when the Predynastic begins. 4000 BC, obviously. And so when they've been digging at sites like Hierakonpolis and Edima, current sites, and they've got the odd radiocarbon date, and the radiocarbon dates were coming out at 3700. And you've got these comments going, oh, no. The absolute dates must be wrong. There's no way Megada 1 would be at 3700 and 3600. If you apply the statistical and mathematical modelling, in terms of probabilities, yes it can. So I think there'll still be a lot of people will still look at single contexts and quibble over these minor things, but I think the suggestion is, I think there's very clear change in the structure of the Predynastic from that end. This, for the Egyptologists, this is quite interesting, 2C, 2D. This is when we get that decorated pottery. It's when we start seeing much more contact with the Near East. There's lots of things happening. It's a very, very short period. Most people just give that a nice 300-year block. I know I did in my PhD. About a century. Again, we're going to have to rethink some of the things about how we're talking about change and tempo. But I think Mike was most pleased, and he'll talk, I'm sure, more about his first dynasty model, where there were an awful lot of dates, 71 in total, and this allowed for a very, very neat sequence. So we already had historical records putting these kings in order. So, this is a mud seal impression with various kings' names. And with material from Abydos and Saqqara, he was able to put these are the kings. And I think there is decadal, generational resolution in this. And despite the model, he tried lots of different models, but the tightness of those dates for this point in prehistory for early Egypt is quite exciting. But I'm not going to steal his thunder and talk about how he put this together. So that's the picture that we've got. It's not even. It's not. If we're thinking about what some of these represent in terms of material culture, it's not necessarily gradual. And so what I'm interested in are these punctuation points. I'm interested in the social conditions that might underpin some of these patterns. Is this just a construction of the present? Or does it reveal something about the dynamics of the 4th millennium BC and the profound developments in social complexity at that time? I'd argue that it does. I argue that I think we can see some interesting things in this picture. And I think that because all of the dates that we have acquired come from specific ritual contexts. And ritual is a very interesting area to study both archaeologically and anthropologically. We could cite Maurice Bloch with his work in Madagascar, Roy Rappaport with his liturgical sequences, Harvey Whitehouse with his modes of religiosity. They all talk about the way in which ritual, in terms of the experience of time, it slows down time, it frames the experience of time in certain ways. It's removing people from mundane time, and they are in this ritual time, and ritual is a creative place where transformations can occur. They also leave very distinct marks in the archaeological record. For Egypt, that's in the funerary domain, in these very rich contexts. So these burial contexts are the contexts in which we've had all of the relative dating. All the relative dating came out of burials. So that's the pottery sequencing came from these contexts. All of the new radiocarbon dates came from burial contexts as well. And what that means is that in any synthesis of temporalities, you have to understand that within the ritual processes that provide the momentum to Egyptian funerary display. That the material basis for our chronologies has come out of ritual action. So instead of talking about gradual stylistic change, I think we can start talking about the active role of individuals and communities in appropriating and knowledgeably transforming production. It all sounds very grand. In the case of early Egypt, it's clear that ceramic production is driven by funerary needs. And this is clear from current excavations. It's a site called Edina in Upper Egypt. And it's one of the few sites where they've excavated a settlement and a cemetery. All of the pottery that we see in the cemetery can be found in the settlement. But not all of the pottery from the settlement is found in the cemetery. They're making very explicit choices. But the types of pottery are also very, very different in terms of their numbers. So marl clay, things like wavy handled pottery and decorated pottery, are in vastly higher proportions in cemeteries and only sporadically found in settlements. So ritual has a very clear material marker. The traditions of pottery manufacture are being driven by the needs for funerary display. So instead of talking about gradual stylistic change, I think we can actually see something more interesting, and this is coming out in the radiocarbon days. So this is your Nagata 2C 2D phase, this kind of pottery, and it's meant to gradually change to 3A, and we get this type of pottery. Mike has done probabilistic sampling to see whether or not these different phases actually can be distinguished. And the interesting thing that's coming out of his models is that Nagata 2D is almost indistinguishable from Nagata 3A. And many of the dates for Nagata 3A are coming from an elite cemetery at Abydos. So while this elite cemetery in Abydos is producing this kind of pottery, everywhere else in the country is quite happy making this kind of pottery. So some communities are they're not just citing previous traditions of mortuary practice. They're appropriating it with something novel, something new, marking life crisis in novel ways. This type of pottery in predynastic graves is always put above the head. It has a particular role in a funeral. So people would have been very, very conscious of this type of pottery, where it's placed. They have a very good idea about how tradition is enacted. And by putting something new, and a lot of it's decorated, you're drawing it out. So people are appropriating this. So what we're seeing is, in the radiocarbon dates, is also how people are changing how they are marking memory and time. Hopefully this will become clearer in my last case study, which I'll just zip through. This is the Kab, Mother of Pots, at Abydos. A very dramatic arena, and under this stands are these. In the background, Cemetery U. This is a cemetery that spans almost the entirety of the 4th millennium BC, these Predynastic pit burials. And here we can see dramatically different mortuary arena. This is the first dynasty, this is the early dynastic period graves. So there's a very clear difference there. Here is Cemetery U. Now, even though these are pit burials, what interests me is that none of these graves overlap. There must have been some way of marking these. So for a period of about 600 years, you've still got a sense of all of those burials going past. In essence, this landscape materialized the longue durée, in the sense that at the start, when they founded this cemetery, Bob's buried there, someone else is buried there. You give that a few generations, where people are named and you forget those names, perhaps, over time. So we've got, you could argue, the generation of ancestors, and that's respected over time. There's a visible and tangible temporal depth. If we're talking about how people experience time, when they're burying their dead here, you have a landscape that's redolent with that deep history. And this is very clear here in front of this tomb. It's tomb UJ, in which we get the first hieroglyphs in Egypt, but it has this offering space in front of it. And we've got a century's worth of pottery, right up to the time of Narmer being placed before it. So, there's a sense of depth, there's a sense of history. So we could construct a nice narrative that could take us to the first kings of Egypt that's based on ancestor worship, generating, and we end up with kings, nice and gradual. But this cemetery completely reorientates the temporal perspective. Instead, these burials, they're not just located in the landscape of their forebears. Each king's burial is a carefully choreographed landscape of other burials, deliberately created to accompany the central burial. From the time of Aha, who has 21 males and 7 lions buried with him, through to Degere, 318 individuals around his tomb. You see, human sacrifice seems to be the most likely explanation. And if it is, it's on an absolutely extraordinary scale. Just to give you a sense of perspective, that's Ahaz, and this is Degers. And you can see this nice, careful, the largest tombs nearest the king, and progressively smaller towards the back. So we've got this very careful orchestration. Here are some of the numbers. I should just add that this is just around the king's burials. These same rulers also had monumental structures not far away. Those were also framed by the newly dead. In the case of Degers, another 300 odd people. That's almost 600 to 700 people that are deliberately buried with the king. That's a very different temporal perspective. You're making a very particular present, and these are dramatic rituals. I don't have time to go into the material dimensions of that. They're also named, so each individual one of these plots is all planned out who's going to go where. In some graves, they've got little red markers. You're going to go there. You're going to go there. It's all planned. It's a massive scale, massive planning. And these are some of the things that are buried with it, and some of the things we dated. This is where a lot of our dates have come from. This and this site in Saqqara. So Abydos is in the south, Saqqara is in the north. The same royal small elite are building these enormous, enormous monuments. There's nothing in the record of this scale before this point. These are just huge. And these are surrounded by hundreds of cattle's horns, so huge feasting. To give you a sense, this is just one chamber in one of these. The amount of pottery, the amount of labour. So these rulers in the First Dynasty were drawing in huge amounts of labour and life. This is a dramatic change in the pace of life, regimes of activity. It's really a tipping point. You know, if we're talking about events in the kind of Gavin Lucas sense, these are archaeological events. They're meaningful in the record. They were undoubtedly meaningful to these past communities in the way in which it fundamentally and irrevocably altered how production and life was seen. There's that story. What is, going back to then, the absolute dates. What is striking about the absolute dates is the detail, the resolution that Mike has been able to get from this, which is really quite extraordinary for this period. I don't think that's just a sample bias. We're able to do this because of the new level of detail brought to social, political and economic life by the First Dynasty royal court. That is why we can do this. That is what's captured here. So what we are capturing here is also what was a fundamental change in, it's not only, so in comparison to the pre-dynastic, we've got very different models. The resolutions are very, very different. That's not a construct of our models. That's actually capturing a fundamental change in the pace and organisation of life back then too. So I think this is just the beginning. I'm still trying to get my head around all of this. But I think there's a very nice way in which we can interpolate the chronometric with the experiences of past communities, because they are grounded in the same materials and have material effects. So just to sum up my exploration of this. Gradualism, that is part of the explanation for the development of the state in Egypt, has a long history, and it is fundamentally and integrally part of how it was originally set up in terms of its relative dating sequences. It's very difficult to get away from that. That's such a dominant frame of reference. It's not just a frame, it's an explanatory apparatus. How do we get out of that? I think we can use absolute dates, because I think we can see alternative tempos of change through them. And we can see those alternative temporal changes if we understand what is producing our data, that our data is coming and produced in ritual and ritual processes. Petrie seriated ritual. Thank you.